Chapter 5 is still dealing with triangles, and on the first section we're dealing with mid-segments of a triangle. A mid-segment of a triangle is a segment connecting the midpoints of two sides of the triangle. So for example, in this picture down here, DE would be my mid-segment because it's connecting the midpoint D and E of that triangle. The theorem, triangle mid-segment theorem, says if a segment joins the midpoints of two sides of a triangle, such as DE, then the segment is parallel to the third side and is half as long. So if I know that DE is a mid-segment, then I know that DE is parallel to AB, and I also know that this length is half the length of AB. So let's look at an example. So here's my first question. In this triangle, T, U, and B are midpoints. What are the lengths of TU, UB, and QR? So let's look at the first one, TU. TU is parallel to SR. So that's how I know I'm going to be using this line segment and this line segment to figure out the length. Well, in the previous theorem, it says that TU is half the length of SR. So if I know that SR is 40, then I would take a half times 40, and I would know that TU is 20. On the next one, UB. UB is this line right here. It's parallel to QS, so that's how I know it's going to be paired with it to find the length. In the formula, it says that UB, the short one, is half the length of QS. So then I know what QS is, so I can plug that in for QS and then take a half times 50 and find that UB is 25. Now, some of you might be at the point after you practice this a couple of times, you can probably do it in your head, such as I can. So you don't have to write all this out unless you need to, but you might want to just until you get the hang of it. Always look at the picture and make sure it makes sense. Obviously, the shorter one should be a smaller number than the bigger one, so make sure that you have that correct. So on the last one, I have QR. And so QR is parallel to TB. So TB would be equal to half the length of QR. So then I plugged in that I know that TB is 30. So in other words, I'm going to double this and multiply 30 by 2 and get 60. Alright, you're going to pause the video and try the next question. So in the got it question, I have this figure, and I went ahead and labeled what they gave me for AD and DE. They wanted me to find DC, so I found that DC is congruent to AD, so therefore DC is also 6. I also had to find what AC is. AC is that entire length. I know AD is 6. I know DC is 6, so therefore AC is 12. Then they wanted me to find EF. EF is parallel to AC, so EF has to be half of that AC. And so we just found the AC is 12, so therefore EF is 6. And then last it wanted me to find DE. DE is parallel with AB, so I know that I'm supposed to find AB, and AB is parallel with DE. DE is half of AB, so when I plug 7.5 in here, I'm going to have to double this in order to find AB. So I take 7.5 times 2 to figure out what AB is. Again, pay attention to what your numbers are. Make sure they make sense. If I'm getting a smaller number than 7.5, then I've done something wrong in my calculations. So always go back and double check that piece. Alright, just a couple more examples here. So what if they don't give me numbers, they give me expressions? So I went ahead and labeled VW as y minus 49 and SU as y minus 54, and I have to find what y is. Well, I still know that SU is a mid-segment, so this has to be half of this length. So one way you can do it is you can set it up that US is half of VW and then plug in what your expressions are. So US is y minus 54, and the VW was the y minus 49. Now just make sure that you're taking a half times both of those, because it's an entire expression with two terms. So one way you could do it is go ahead and solve that, where you can do a half times y, a half times the 49, and get this. Then I subtracted 1/2 to the other side, so 1 minus a half is a half y. Then I brought down everything else, and then I needed to add 54 over here, so I did negative 24.5 plus 54 and got this. And then I needed to finish, so I took 29.5 and divided by a half, which is the same thing as multiplying by 2. So I got y to equal 59. Now another approach to do it is if you don't like dealing with all of the fractions and the decimal part of it, you could understand that if I'm dealing with this being a half, instead of distributing this half through, I could just multiply this side by 2, and then that would take care of this fraction. So that's what I'm showing you over here. So if you would prefer this route, so after you have it set up, instead of multiplying this 1/2 through, come over to this side and multiply by 2 and then cross this 1/2 out, so it looks like this. And then you would still need to solve, so then I would have to distribute. I subtracted 1y from 2y. I added 108 to negative 49, and so then I still got the same answer. So it's just your preference. If this confuses you, just keep this same process over and over. But for those of you that want something that doesn't involve decimals and fractions, this is a shortcut you can do after you have it set it up, so you don't have to deal with that 1/2. Alright, you're going to pause the video and try the next question. So in the next one, I still have UW as a mid-segment, and then they gave me ST, so I figured that UW has to be half of ST. So then I went ahead and plugged it in. I'm showing you that you can plug it in here and then go ahead and distribute. So 1/2 times Q, 1/2 there, minus 1/2 over, subtract 14, take 15.5 and divide by 1/2 or double it, and that would make it 31. But keep in mind that it's not asking for Q in this, it's asking for ST. So I would have to plug back in what I found for Q in the expression for ST. So ST was Q plus 59, so I'd have to plug 31 back in for Q, and so ST would be 90. Now remember, you can also do the shortcut if you don't prefer using the fractions. So at this point after I set it up, you could cross off this 1/2 and then multiply this side by 2, and then still run through your solving techniques. So distribute minus 1Q, subtract 28, and still get 31. So I just want to make sure you're aware of that trick. That might help some of you, but again, if it's confusing, then keep it consistent and use your calculator to help you with those fractions. Okay, so mid-segments. If you have a mid-segment, then I know that it's parallel to one of the other lines, and I also know that I can find the length of one of them because of that formula.